have a strange and haunting story to tell, an encounter I had some time ago with a railway signalman, whose tale has never left me. It began when I was out walking near a railway cutting, a deep, narrow trench carved between steep, wet stone walls for a line of train tracks. The sun was setting, casting everything in a crimson glow. As I stood at the top, I saw a man far below, standing at the door of his signal box with a flag in hand. I called down to him, "Allo, below there." Oddly, instead of looking up as you would expect a man to do when hearing a voice from above, he turned and looked down the railway line. There was something unusual, even unsettling, about the way he did it. I called again, "Hello, below." Only then did he turn and look up at me. I asked him if there was a path I could take down to speak with him. He didn't answer right away, but stared at me, silently, thoughtfully, until a train came rushing through with such force that I stepped back instinctively. After it had passed, he quietly motioned to a spot a little way down the ridge, and I found a zigzag path carved into the damp rock down to the tracks. As I descended, I had time to reflect on the reluctance he had shown, as if pointing out that path had been a hard decision for him. By the time I got down into the cutting, I found him standing between the rails, waiting for me with an expectant, watchful pose. He was a dark, solemn-looking man, and his post was desolate, bounded by steep, wet stone walls, with a red signal light casting a muted, gloomy glow at one end, and a dark tunnel mouth at the other. When I came up to him, he took a step back, still keeping his eyes on mine. I remarked how lonely the place must be, and how his solitude naturally caught my attention from above. I made some friendly conversation and explained that I was simply a curious visitor, now free to explore the world after a life spent indoors, and that I had a growing interest in great engineering works like this one. But even as I spoke, I could feel something about him held back, something troubled or weary in his manner. He looked toward the red light again with keen intensity, as if studying it or sensing something. When I asked if that light was under his care, he responded softly, "Don't you know it is?" It gave me a strange feeling. Half in my mind, the ridiculous idea that I might be speaking to something other than a man. I even stepped back in hesitation, but quickly realized there was fear in his face too. He may have been just as unsettled by me as I was by him. After he assured me that he had mistaken me for someone else, we carried on talking more freely. I asked about his duties. He told me he had little manual work. His job mostly involved operating signals and maintaining lights and always being ready to respond to the electric bell. He had grown so used to the isolation that he hardly questioned it anymore, though at times he would sneak up into the sunlight for a brief moment of light and relief, though never for long in case his bell rang. He seemed well educated, and I told him so. He admitted that he'd once studied natural philosophy and had attended lectures when he was younger, but he had squandered those opportunities, slipped out of a better path, and ended up here. He blamed no one but himself. However, 2 or 3 times during our conversation, he abruptly broke off, not because the bell rang, but because he thought he had heard it. He opened the door quickly and looked out toward the tunnel and the red signal, then returned with that same indescribable expression I'd seen before. Before I left, I told him, "You almost strike me as a contented man." He seemed reluctant to admit it, but then said quietly, "I used to be, but I am troubled, sir. I am troubled." I pushed. What was troubling him, he replied, "It is very difficult to speak of. Very, very difficult. If you make another visit, I will try." I promised to return, and as I left, he told me, not quite casually, that I should not call out to him from above when I returned. Not when I came up the path. Not when I reached the top. His insistence unsettled me. Before we parted, he asked me one last question. "What made you call out, 'Hello, below there,' just now?" Surprised, I said, "It just happened. I saw you below." "That was exactly what was said." "Yes, I think so." He stared at me. "You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He nodded quietly, and we said goodnight. I returned promptly the next evening. We met without him needing to be called. Once inside the signal box again, seated by the fire, He told me everything. He confessed that the previous night when I had called out to him, he believed I was someone or something else. He began describing a figure, an apparition, that appeared to him at precisely the same spot where I had stood, near the red light by the tunnel. He had seen it on 3 separate occasions. The first time on a moonlit night, the figure had stood near the tunnel mouth, shouting down in a hoarse voice, "Hello, below there, look out, look out!" and waving one arm frantically, the other across its face. He ran toward it with his lamp, but just as he reached it, it disappeared. He searched the tunnel, climbing ladders, signaling the stations. Nothing. They all reported things as normal, but just hours after that, a terrible train accident occurred on that very stretch of track. People were killed and injured, and the spot where the ghost had stood was the very place the injured were brought through. I suggested, though reluctantly, that perhaps it had all been a coincidence, hallucination fueled by stress or illness. I tried to be rational, but he returned with an even more disturbing detail. A few months later, the ghost appeared again. This time it made no sound. It simply stood by the red light, covering its face in silent mourning. He was unable to approach it then. But later that day, as a train passed, a woman in one of the compartments suddenly died. She was brought into the signal box and laid right where we now sat. Then, just days before my visit, the ghost had returned again. The same gestures, the same desperate waving, the same silent cry, multiple times, ringing the bell in a strange way that only he could hear. I pointed out that I'd been with him the previous evening, and neither the bell rang nor anything unusual occurred, yet he had seemed disturbed. But he insisted. He had heard and seen the ghost then too. I asked him, what did he think it meant? He said, "There is danger somewhere on the line, but what it is, or where, it refuses to tell. It torments me with warning, yet gives no guidance. If I telegraph the station, I'm dismissed for issuing false alarms, but if I don't do anything and something happens, what then?" His agony was clear, the sense of urgent responsibility without the ability to act. So I tried to calm him, telling him that all anyone could do was his duty, nothing more. He grew calmer. As the night progressed, his work once again kept him busy, and though I offered to stay longer, he said no. The next evening I set out again, but decided to take a short walk first, expecting to meet him later. From the top of the railway cutting, I looked down and froze. By the tunnel mouth stood a man waving his arm violently, left hand shielding his eyes, exactly as the ghost had been described. My heart dropped. Then I realized it wasn't a ghost. It was real. A group of railway workers were down there. A tarp-covered hut had been quickly set up. Something had happened. When I reached them, they gave me the terrible news. The signalman, my signalman, had been struck and killed by a passing train that very morning. He had apparently stepped onto the line, unaware of the oncoming engine. The driver said he had shouted out to him with all his strength, "Hello! Below there! Look out! Look out! For God's sake, clear the way!" The very words the signalman had heard from the ghost, and the precise gesture he had described. It was no longer a matter of mystery or discussion. It had happened. The warnings were real, and he had been their final target. That's the end of the story. But to this day, I can't help but shudder, remembering how the warning ended with the man it haunted.
Let's take a moment to reflect on Charles Dickens' short story, The Signalman, a ghost story wrapped in mystery, psychological tension, and haunting premonition. On the surface, it's a tale of a railway signalman visited by a supernatural figure that seems to foretell disaster. But when we look deeper, this is a story that deals with isolation, fate, guilt, and the limits of human understanding. To begin with, the setting itself does a lot of the work. Dickens immerses us in a dark and narrow world. The railway cutting is like a trench carved into the earth, and the signalman's post is a kind of prison. He lives at the bottom of this damp stone channel, with only strips of sky and the occasional clatter of trains to remind him that there is a world beyond. The only color that stands out in the gloom is the red signal light near the tunnel, what we might now recognize as a symbol of both alert and doom. This unnatural setting isolates the signalman not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The landscape mirrors his inner world, lonely, heavy with silence, and haunted by an unseen danger. Now, onto the characters. The narrator is an educated man, a curious outsider who encounters the signalman one evening and becomes intrigued by his strange behavior. At first, he observes the signalman with a degree of polite interest, somewhat skeptical but eager to connect. But it isn't long before that interest deepens into concern, then confusion, and finally a profound unease. And then there's the signalman himself. He is the most tragic figure in this story, intelligent, sincere, highly diligent, but deeply burdened. He's not mad, not in the traditional sense. He's meticulous in his duties and thoughtful in conversation. He even teaches himself mathematics and a new language in his isolation. But he's also witnessing something he can't understand, something supernatural yet undeniably real to him. The ghostly apparition appears near the red light, performing the same desperate gestures, covering its face, waving an arm, and calling out warnings that mirror the narrator's very first words. "Hello! Below there!" What increases the tension is that each time the ghost appears, tragedy follows. The first time, a terrifying train collision. The second, the sudden death of a young woman. The third, the most heartbreaking, ends with the death of the signalman himself. It's important to note that Dickens never tells us outright whether the ghost is real or a hallucination. And that's precisely the point. The horror of the story rests not in what we know, but in what we cannot explain. Whether the ghost is a supernatural warning or a symbol of the signalman's deteriorating mental state, neither conclusion feels comforting. Because in the end, he was right. Something was going to happen. He felt helpless to stop it, and ultimately he became its victim. There's also a haunting irony in the story's final scene. Everything the signalman described, the gesture, the words, the figure, are repeated by the train driver in his dying moment. The warnings were real, but the signalman could do nothing to interpret or act on them meaningfully. He could perceive disaster, but not prevent it. This brings us to one of the story's most significant themes: helplessness in the face of fate. Dickens wrote this story during a time of rapid technological change. Trains were new and fast, and with them came accidents, upheaval, and literal collisions of progress and human vulnerability. The railway, a symbol of modernity, also becomes a backdrop for ghostly warnings and psychological breakdowns, almost as if the past is calling out to warn the present of the damage it might cause. There's also something deeply prophetic about the story. Dickens himself was in a train crash the year before he wrote it, the infamous Staplehurst rail disaster of 1865. He reportedly never fully recovered from the trauma. That might explain the intensity of fear and disconnection in the signalman. He had touched tragedy firsthand. Perhaps this haunting tale was his way of processing it. But beyond history, beyond ghosts, the signalman also poses a very philosophical question. What do we do when we're given warnings we can't understand? How do we bear the weight of knowledge we can neither explain nor act upon? It's not just a ghost story. It's a reflection on conscience, responsibility, and the awful burden of insight without agency. The narrator tries to stay grounded in logic and reason, but even he becomes unsettled. He wants to help, but doesn't know how. And when he returns too late, the lesson becomes clear. Some tragedies are simply beyond our control. In the end, the signalman leaves us with no easy answers. It leaves us instead with atmosphere, with emotion, and with a lingering sense of dread. That some tragedies can be sensed but not stopped, and that even the most competent, most careful of us are sometimes powerless in the hands of fate. It's a quiet horror, not the kind that jumps out at you, but the kind that settles slowly into the back of your mind. And it stays there. Let's take a moment to reflect on Charles Dickens' short story The Signalman, a ghost story wrapped in mystery, psychological tension, and haunting premonition. On the surface, it's a tale of a railway signalman visited by a supernatural figure that seems to foretell disaster. But when we look deeper, this is a story that deals with isolation, fate, guilt, and the limits of human understanding. To begin with, the setting itself does a lot of the work. Dickens immerses us in a dark and narrow world. The railway cutting is like a trench carved into the earth, and the signalman's post is a kind of prison. He lives at the bottom of this damp stone channel, with only strips of sky and the occasional clatter of trains to remind him that there is a world beyond. The only color that stands out in the gloom is the red signal light near the tunnel, what we might now recognize as a symbol of both alert and doom. This unnatural setting isolates the signalman not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The landscape mirrors his inner world, lonely, heavy with silence, and haunted by an unseen danger. Now, onto the characters. A thoughtful narrator visits a lonely signalman at his remote railway post. The man reveals he's haunted by ghostly visions that seem to predict fatal accidents. The narrator is drawn into the mystery, until the final vision becomes a terrifying reality with deadly consequences. We've got everything we need here. A strong protagonist, the narrator, rational and curious. A supernatural antagonist, or maybe fate itself. A compelling conflict. Ghostly warnings that seem real but cannot be explained or stopped. And the open-ended question, can anything be done to change what's already been seen? Now, according to Save the Cat, this story falls under the monster in the house genre. Why? Well, first, we have a monster. It's not a werewolf or a serial killer. It's something more intangible. It's the ghost. This strange figure is terrifying not because it attacks, but because it warns. And its warnings are always followed by death. It's a supernatural presence, and its power lies not in violence but in prophecy. Then we have a house, in this case a literal one, the signal box. But house here doesn't just mean a building, it means an enclosed space. The signalman's world is boxed in on every side, surrounded by stone, tunnel, and track. It's claustrophobic in every sense, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Finally, there's a sin. It's subtle here. Perhaps it's neglect of men like the signalman, left alone in remote conditions. Perhaps it's his indecision, or society's failure to listen until it's too late. But like all sin in this genre, it triggers the monster and leads to tragedy. Now let's walk through the 15 beats of the Blake Snyder beat sheet as they apply to the signalman. 1. Opening image. The story opens with an eerie visual. The narrator, standing at the edge of a massive railway cutting as the sun sets behind him, casting everything below in an angry red glow. He calls down to a man standing far beneath him. Hello. Below there. A strange greeting. And as we'll see, those words mean more than either man realizes. 2. Theme stated. Soon after, the theme is quietly introduced through atmosphere and tone. What do we do with warnings we don't understand? What happens when we're powerless to help? These mysteries are at the heart of the story, and they're not easy to answer. 3. The setup. The narrator makes his way down into the cutting and meets the signalman in his lonely outpost. We learn about his isolated life, his duties with the signals and telegraphs, and we sense something deeper is bothering him. The setting tells us everything. This is a man surrounded by darkness, steps away from danger, and carrying a heavy secret. 4. Catalyst. The signalman quietly admits, I am troubled, sir, deeply troubled. He hints that a strange force is at work, but says nothing more for now. Instead, he asks the narrator to return the next night, promising to explain. This is the moment the story changes. 5. Debate. The narrator walks away unsettled. What does the signalman mean? Is he ill? Mentally unstable? Or is there somehow truth in what he says? The narrator is skeptical, but curious enough to come back. 6. Break into Act 2. He returns, and this time goes all in. The signalman begins telling him everything. About the ghost. How it appears, how it gestures, and how each appearance has been followed by deadly events. This isn't the ordinary world anymore. This is the world of the unexplained. 7. B-story. This forms in the relationship between the narrator and the signalman. There's mutual trust here, forming quickly under strange circumstances. It's through this connection that the narrator becomes more than just a witness. He becomes a struggling participant, stuck between belief and doubt. 8. Fun and games. Here's where we get the ghost story. Details pile higher. The figure appeared months ago, shouting and waving. A tragic train crash happened mere hours later. Then another appearance. This time silent, but followed the same day by the sudden death of a young woman on a train. Now the ghost has returned. 9. Midpoint. Here the stakes shift drastically. This isn't about things that have happened. Now something will. The ghost's warning is active. The signalman is convinced that another death is coming, and soon. And no one knows what to do. 10. Bad guys close in. The signalman becomes more haunted, more exhausted. He hears the bell ring when no one else does. He sees what no one else can. Even the narrator begins to feel the pressure of the unknown. that sick weight of helpless anticipation. 11. All is lost. The narrator leaves, empty-handed. He still doesn't believe, but he worries. He's beginning to regret doing nothing. This is the moment when everything could collapse. And as it turns out, it does. 12. Dark night of the soul. The narrator debates what he should have done. Should he have told someone? Warned the railway authorities? Was silence a mistake? He still thinks he has time to decide. But he doesn't. 13. Break into Act 3. The next evening, it all falls apart. The narrator returns, only to see a group of workers by the tunnel. Something horrific has happened. 14. Finale. The signalman is dead. A train has struck him. And here's the twist that seals the story. The train driver says he called out to the man. "Hello. Below there. Look out," waving his arm, covering his face. Just like the ghost. The final warning was for the signalman himself. And although he saw it coming, he couldn't stop it. 15. Final image. The red light still glows. The cutting is still there. The narrator walks away changed. The ghost's warning is over, but its message lingers. So what do we take away from The Signalman? It's not just a masterfully structured ghost story. It's a meditation on something deeper. On fate. On helplessness. On intuition we can't explain, and guilt we can't escape from. Dickens lived through a train crash himself, and when he wrote this story, he infused it with not just horror, but heartbreak. A silent question runs through the whole tale. What if the signs were there, and we just didn't know how to read them? Thanks so much for listening to this Save the Cat breakdown of The Signalman. If you enjoyed this narrative dissection, be sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment.